What if the ground beneath your feet is nothing more than a vast graveyard waiting to be uncovered? Have you ever stared at a thin layer of ancient rock and wondered how an entire world could be trapped within it? Deep within the desolate Badlands of North America, hidden inside the geological records of a place known as Hell Creek, there lies a strange, paper-thin line of dust. It is a boundary of iridium, an element that is exceedingly rare on the surface of our planet, yet overwhelmingly common in the cold, drifting expanse of deep space. How did an extraterrestrial fingerprint come to rest across the entire globe exactly 66 million years ago? Was it a silent warning? A random celestial accident? Or a cosmic inevitability? Imagine the prehistoric sky, vast and untouched, turning from a familiar light to a blinding, searing plasma in a fraction of a heartbeat. What happens when the absolute rulers of an age, creatures of unimaginable scale and dominance, look up to see a second sun descending upon them? Can an empire that thrived for millions of years truly be erased in a single day? We are about to uncover the most terrifying 24 hours this planet has ever endured. A rapid sequence of fire, shattering Earth, and suffocating darkness that rewrote the very blueprint of existence. How did the global ecosystem collapse so suddenly and completely? And what fragile sparks of life managed to hide in the shadows to inherit the smoking ruins of a shattered world? Welcome to Quiet Expeditions. Lower your shoulders, let go of the present, and let us drift backward through the deep and silent currents of time to the final hours before the great darkness fell. Are you ready to walk into the twilight of the giants? To truly comprehend the absolute terror of the end, we must first walk through the blindingly beautiful illusion of permanence that preceded it. Cast your mind back across the vast, silent ocean of 66 million years and imagine a world that breathes with a heavy, intoxicating rhythm. This is an era where life on Earth has reached its staggering peak of diversity. Do you see the vibrant expanse unfolding before you? Dense, towering forests of ancient conifers, broad-leafed trees, and giant ferns blanket the shifting continents, painting the land masses in an unbroken sea of emerald green. The air is thick, profoundly humid, and heavy with the rich, earthy scent of blooming flora and decaying wood, creating a greenhouse sanctuary that stretches from the equator to the poles. In this verdant paradise, dinosaurs rule absolutely every conceivable ecosystem. They are the unchallenged architects of the prehistoric landscape. Listen closely to the ground. Can you feel the deep, rhythmic tremors vibrating through the soil? Those are the footfalls of titans, creatures of such immense scale and biological perfection that they seem invincible. Massive herds of armored herbivores carve broad paths through the dense underbrush, consuming mountains of vegetation with the slow, deliberate confidence of beings that have never known an equal. Above them, the canopy is alive with the screeching calls of winged reptiles, casting fleeting, jagged shadows over the forest floor. And lurking in the dappled sunlight of the tree lines are the apex predators, the ultimate killing machines, their senses perfectly tuned to the slightest movement of their prey. They are the undisputed masters of a food chain so complex, so intricately balanced that it appears indestructible. Why would any creature fear the future when the past has provided such an unbroken lineage of triumph? These magnificent beasts are not fragile experiments of nature. They are the ultimate survivors. Their ancestors had already weathered the slow, grinding wrath of volcanic eruptions, adapted to extreme climate shifts, and successfully navigated their way through multiple extinction events that had previously scoured the planet. For tens of millions of years, they have dominated Earth, evolving, diverging, and conquering every corner of the globe. They are at the absolute zenith of their reign, existing in a magnificent symphony of tooth, claw, and scale. Yet, is there not a profound tragedy hidden within the perfection of this ancient world? Consider the shallow, sunlit seas that lap gently against the shores of what we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. The waters here are remarkably warm and teeming with a dazzling array of marine life, resting upon a seabed rich in carbonate and sulfur-bearing sediments. Giant marine reptiles glide effortlessly through the coral reefs, their sleek bodies cutting through the azure depths with a terrifying grace. The oceans, much like the land, are flourishing in an era of unprecedented stability and abundance. Every biological niche is filled. Every predator and prey is locked in a timeless evolutionary dance. It is a masterpiece of planetary engineering. But does a masterpiece ever know when the final brushstroke has been applied? As the great herbivores graze in the golden hour of the afternoon, and the predators rest with full bellies beneath the colossal ferns, they do not look up at the ancient sky. Why would they? For countless generations, the heavens have offered nothing but the life-giving warmth of the sun, the gentle cycle of the moon, and the familiar, nourishing rains. The sky is an ally, a constant, unthreatening roof over their thriving kingdom. They do not possess the capacity to understand the cold, unforgiving mechanics of the universe. They cannot conceive that the very forces that shaped their beautiful world are the exact same forces preparing to tear it apart. How is it possible that an entire planet can be so agonizingly blind to its own impending doom? Beneath the massive, scaly feet of the dinosaurs, small, insignificant creatures, our distant mammalian ancestors, scurry in the dark, damp shadows of the undergrowth, surviving only on the scraps left behind by the giants. They live in perpetual fear of the colossal beasts that rule the daylight. Neither the giant nor the shrew realizes that the hierarchy of this world is about to be violently and permanently inverted. The stability of the Late Cretaceous period is the grandest deception ever orchestrated by nature. As the terrestrial and marine ecosystems pulse with vibrant, unrestrained life, flourishing in an almost arrogant display of abundance, a cold and inevitable physical process is quietly advancing far beyond the thin, protective veil of the atmosphere. The warmth of the prehistoric sun is a lie. The gentle rustling of the fern leaves in the wind is a lie. The solid, unyielding earth beneath their feet is the greatest lie of all. Time has run out. The hourglass of the dinosaurs was shattered long before the final grain of sand could fall. Are we not also living in a similar state of blissful ignorance, assuming that our current reality will stretch endlessly into tomorrow? Let us leave the warm, sunlit forests of the doomed giants for a moment and cast our gaze upward into the freezing, breathless void of deep space, where a silent assassin has been traveling in the dark for millions of years, locked onto a trajectory from which there is absolutely no escape. Where does a world-ending catastrophe truly begin? Does it start in the sudden, blinding moment of impact? Or is the architecture of absolute doom drawn billions of years before the victims even take their first breath? To find the true, terrifying origin of the dinosaurs' demise, we must willingly leave the warm, sun-drenched forests of the Cretaceous Earth and travel deep into the freezing, breath-stealing vacuum of the solar system. Far beyond the red dust of Mars, suspended in the eternal, unforgiving night, lies a vast and chaotic graveyard. This is the main asteroid belt. It is a cold, drifting expanse that contains millions of rocky remnants, the scattered debris left over from the violent, swirling formation of the planet some 4.6 billion years ago. Imagine this desolate region, an endless sea of silent stones floating gracefully in the absolute zero of space. For untold eons, most of these celestial bodies follow incredibly stable orbits, locked in a perpetual, harmonic dance around the distant sun. They are the discarded building blocks of a universe that never quite managed to pull them together into a whole, cohesive world. But what happens when the delicate, mathematical balance of this cosmic dance is ever so slightly disturbed? The architect of the greatest catastrophe in terrestrial history was not a sentient enemy, nor was it a calculated, purposeful weapon. It was merely a fragment, a jagged, lifeless chunk of rock and metal, believed to have been born from violent, ancient collisions between silicate and metallic asteroids. Can you picture the sheer, terrifying brutality of that ancient impact in the deep dark? Two silent floating leviathans crashing against one another, violently shattering into a million pieces without producing a single echo or sound. Among the sprawling debris field, one specific fragment was cast adrift. It was a scarred, unremarkable stone, tumbling aimlessly through the void, carrying no malice and no intent. For millions upon millions of years, it remained just another harmless wanderer, lost in a swirling sea of millions just like it. How does an ordinary piece of cosmic rubble floating in the dark slowly transform into a harbinger of global extinction? The answer lies not in an explosive burst of sudden energy, but in the slow, silent, and terrifyingly patient mechanics of gravity. Looming ominously in the deeper darkness of the outer solar system is Jupiter, a monstrous gas giant whose immense gravitational presence acts as the great shepherd of the planetary neighborhood. Even from hundreds of millions of miles away, across the black ocean of space, the gravitational pull of giant planets, such as Jupiter, can subtly alter the path of certain asteroids. It is not a violent snatching, but a gentle, invisible, and persistent tug. A slight disturbance, a microscopic shift in trajectory sustained over millions of years, is more than enough to slowly warp the path of a harmless rock, ultimately transforming it into a fateful traveler heading inexorably toward the sun, and by tragic, unavoidable consequence, toward Earth. Is it not profoundly chilling to realize that an invisible force, acting quietly across unimaginable distances, can methodically sign the death warrant of an entire biological kingdom? This is the mesmerizing and deeply terrifying nature of solar system dynamics, a system where every single motion is intricately and permanently interconnected. In the vast, uncaring clockwork of the cosmos, a minor collision in deep space can trigger a chain reaction that unfolds relentlessly across millions of years. A tiny rock bumps into a larger one, slightly altering its spin. That larger rock drifts marginally closer to the deep gravitational well of Jupiter. The giant planet tugs back, shifting the rock's trajectory by just a fraction of a degree. It is a cosmic butterfly effect, wherein the smallest, most seemingly insignificant changes lead directly to consequences on a massive planetary scale. The asteroid's orbit was not shifted overnight. It was a terrifyingly gradual process, its path shifting little by little under the relentless gravitational influence of neighboring planets. Through complex dynamical models, modern science suggests that large asteroids may require tens of millions of years to completely transition from their stable, circular orbits into erratic paths that eventually intersect Earth's orbit. Tens of millions of years. Let that immense, almost incomprehensible scale of time wash over you. While the magnificent dinosaurs were busy evolving, raising their young, and fighting for absolute dominance under the warm Cretaceous sun, their executioner was already falling silently toward them. The contrast forms one of the greatest and most deeply tragic paradoxes in the entire history of life. While vibrant, complex ecosystems flourished in a state of apparent stability and boundless abundance on the surface of our world, a cold, unfeeling, and completely inevitable physical process was quietly advancing just beyond the protective veil of the atmosphere. It is a slow, methodical countdown that no living creature could possibly hear or understand. As the asteroid was finally nudged completely out of the main belt, it began a long, spiraling descent toward the inner solar system. It crossed the orbits of the outer planets, a silent, gray ghost passing through the dark. It began to feel the increasing warmth of the sun upon its frozen, silicate, and metallic surface. How many times in planetary history has the course of organic evolution been violently shaped, not by biological competition or terrestrial climate change, but by wandering stones in space? This ragged fragment of a forgotten cosmic collision was now locked into a fatal, unstoppable trajectory. There was no steering mechanism, no conscious intent, only the blind, mathematical certainty of orbital mechanics pushing it forward. The universe does not possess a moral compass. It operates purely on mass, velocity, and gravity. And so, the quiet chain of events that had already begun in a distant corner of the solar system moved relentlessly into its final, terminal phase. The harmless rock had become a loaded cosmic bullet. As it drifted closer and closer to the fragile blue marble suspended in the blackness, it carried with it the accumulated kinetic energy of a billion-year journey. Every passing second, the distance narrowed. Every single day, the mathematical probability of a collision shifted closer toward absolute certainty. Have we, as a fragile species ourselves, ever truly paused to consider how precariously our own existence balances against the cold, grinding gears of the cosmos? Imagine a mountain that does not rest gently upon the earth, but instead is a mountain violently torn from the crust of an unknown, shattered world, suspended endlessly in the absolute, freezing nothingness of the cosmic void. This wandering tombstone, a celestial body roughly 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter, is completely devoid of warmth, completely devoid of light, and completely devoid of life. It possesses no breath, no beating heart, and no memory of the ancient darkness where it was originally born. It is merely a jagged, unfeeling amalgamation of silicate and metallic elements, forged in the violent crucibles of ancient collisions long before the very first spark of life ever flickered within the primordial oceans of our world. As this colossal fragment drifts inward toward the inner solar system, the faint, distant light of the sun begins to cast long, harsh, and unforgiving shadows across its pitted, heavily scarred surface. There is absolutely no sound to be heard in this desolate place. In the perfect, suffocating vacuum of deep space, even the most violent cosmic events occur in a profound, deafening silence. If you were somehow floating right beside this massive object, you would hear nothing at all. You would only feel the terrifying, icy indifference of an object that is governed entirely by the unforgiving laws of mass and velocity. How is it possible that something so utterly dead, so entirely devoid of consciousness, can possess the power to extinguish so much vibrant, breathing life? As the great stone crosses the invisible boundary of the inner solar system, it is no longer just drifting aimlessly. It is now falling with a terrifying mathematical purpose. Dynamical models suggest that large asteroids may require tens of millions of years to completely transition from their stable orbits in the outer dark into fateful paths that directly intersect Earth's orbit. For tens of millions of years, this rock has been secretly falling toward a blue oasis, pulled relentlessly by the massive gravitational well of the sun. Directly in its path, spinning gracefully and completely unaware in the dark, is a fragile sphere of swirling white clouds and deep azure oceans. The asteroid is now racing toward Earth at an incomprehensible speed of nearly 20 kilometers per second. Let that measurement sink deeply into your mind. 20 kilometers covered in a single fleeting second. That staggering velocity is equivalent to about 70,000 kilometers per hour. This speed is vastly faster than any natural object humanity has ever witnessed in all of modern history. Yet, in the limitless black ocean of space, this terrifying speed creates a bizarre, almost beautiful optical illusion. Because there is no air to tear at its jagged edges, no friction to slow its rapid descent, and no atmosphere to ignite its metallic surface, it appears to glide with a slow, almost majestic grace. It is a silent phantom, a ghost of ancient rock falling smoothly through the eternal night. Does the universe possess a cruel sense of irony, allowing the ultimate instrument of global destruction to approach its target with such profound, undisturbed tranquility? While this cold, dead rock hurtles through the silent dark, what is happening on the vibrant, breathing world below? Beneath the swirling atmospheric currents and the deep, sunlit oceans, the Earth is pulsating with energy. The dense, towering forests continue to blanket the shifting continents in a rich, emerald embrace, completely untouched by the shadow falling from the stars. Giant herbivores lower their massive armored heads to drink from crystal-clear streams, their heavy bodies relaxed in the late afternoon warmth. Apex predators stalk silently through the high ferns, their powerful muscles tensed, their golden eyes focused entirely on the immediate, bloodthirsty hunt. They are completely consumed by the intricate daily struggle for survival. They do not know that their entire world, their entire genetic lineage, is about to be violently and permanently erased. How profoundly tragic is it that the absolute pinnacle of biological evolution is completely blind to the astronomical physics that govern its ultimate fate? The warm, pulsing blood of the Cretaceous animals flows in stark, horrifying contrast to the frozen, metallic veins of the approaching asteroid. One represents the fragile, beautiful miracle of biology. The other represents the cold, mathematical certainty of astrophysics. And these two completely different realities are destined to intersect in a matter of moments. Consider the enormous, almost infinite store of kinetic energy that is quietly accumulating within this tumbling mountain of rock. Every single millimeter of its journey over millions of years of motion has added to its devastating potential. Energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be stored and eventually transferred. All of the momentum borrowed from the gravitational pull of giant planets, all of the velocity gained from falling endlessly toward the sun, is locked tightly inside this 10 to 12 kilometer sphere. It is a cosmic vault holding a payload of unimaginable destructive force, waiting patiently for a solid surface upon which to unleash it. Do the fundamental laws of physics care about the magnificent creatures walking upon the Earth? Does gravity pause for even a fraction of a second to consider the complexity of a prehistoric food chain or the fragile beauty of a sprawling coral reef? The universe is completely blind. It does not feel empathy. It does not offer mercy, and it does not grant second chances. It only obeys the rigid, unbending equations of motion and mass. As the distance between the asteroid and the Earth rapidly diminishes from millions of kilometers to hundreds of thousands, the blue planet begins to loom larger against the backdrop of distant, uncaring stars. The white swirls of ancient storm systems and the vast, dark blue expanses of the oceans come into sharp, terrifying focus. From the perspective of the falling stone, the Earth is a magnificent, welcoming target. Somewhere beneath those thick cloud layers lies a quiet, shallow sea, an area rich in carbonate and sulfur-bearing sediments. This specific location, a tranquil coastal region that we now know as the Yucatan Peninsula, is about to become ground zero for a planetary reset. The asteroid does not aim. It does not consciously choose its landing site. It is entirely a matter of cruel, random chance that it will strike one of the most chemically dangerous regions on the entire planet. A fateful location that will amplify the global climate effects to catastrophic levels when the sulfur-rich rocks are heated. What if the Earth had been rotated just slightly differently on its axis? What if the rock had arrived just a few hours earlier or a few hours later, plunging into the deep, open waters of the Pacific Ocean instead of a shallow, sulfurous sea? Would the gentle giants have survived the impact? The distance is now measured in mere thousands of kilometers. The final hours have silently bled into the final minutes. The asteroid crosses the orbit of the moon, a silent shadow slipping past a dead world, heading straight like an arrow for a living one. The massive dinosaurs below continue their ancient, unbroken rhythms, completely oblivious to the immense pressure building directly above their heads. There is no alarm sounding in the forests. There is no sudden change in the wind. There is only the steady, comforting beat of a prehistoric world that believes it will last forever. But the long, quiet journey of the wandering stone is finally over. The cold, silent phase of the catastrophe is at a permanent end. the barrier between space and Earth, the thin, fragile layer of atmosphere that has protected life for untold eons, is about to be violently breached. As we watch this colossal mountain of rock fall the final few hundred kilometers toward the atmosphere, we must ask ourselves a deeply terrifying question. If the universe can erase 100 million years of evolution in a single, silent stroke of astronomical bad luck, how secure is the ground upon which we currently build our own fragile civilizations? The unbearable silence of deep space is about to be violently, irrevocably broken. How thin is the boundary between absolute safety and total annihilation? We often look up at the sky and see a boundless, comforting canopy, an invisible shield that has nurtured and protected life for untold ages. For millions of years, the Earth's atmosphere has acted as a silent guardian, burning away tiny cosmic intruders before they could ever reach the fragile soil below. But what happens when the intruder is not a stray pebble, but a wandering mountain forged in the ancient dark? The long, silent journey of the asteroid was coming to a sudden, violent end. As the immense sphere of rock and metal crossed the invisible threshold of the upper atmosphere, the profound silence of deep space was shattered in an instant. The moment began with a vivid, terrifying streak of light suddenly appearing along the edge of the ancient sky. It was a celestial body roughly 10 to 12 kilometers in diameter, racing toward Earth at a staggering speed of nearly 20 kilometers per second. Can you truly fathom the sheer terror of such a velocity? That is equivalent to about 70,000 kilometers per hour. It is a speed vastly faster than any natural object humanity has witnessed in modern history. At that incomprehensible speed, the asteroid did not simply fall gracefully through the air. It slammed into the atmosphere like a colossal bullet, carrying unimaginable kinetic energy. The sky was literally torn open. As the massive object plummeted, the air molecules directly in its path could not move out of the way quickly enough. Instead of parting, the air was subjected to violent compression, crushed against the leading edge of the falling stone with catastrophic force. This violent compression of air generated a blazing plasma sheath that entirely enveloped the body. The cold, dead rock that had drifted invisibly through the freezing void for millions of years was suddenly reborn as a massive fireball, burning with an intensity far brighter than the sun when seen from the ground. Imagine standing in the dense, humid fern forests of the Late Cretaceous, where the warm sunlight has dictated the rhythms of life for countless generations. Suddenly, the shadows cast by the towering trees begin to shift and sharpen with alarming speed. A second sun has appeared in the heavens, but this sun is not life-giving. It is searing, blinding, and expanding rapidly across the horizon. The majestic herbivores halt their grazing. The apex predators lose their focus on the hunt. Every creature that possesses eyes is forced to witness the terrifying arrival of an unearthly light. They do not possess the capacity to understand what is happening. How could they possibly comprehend that the heavens themselves are falling? As the asteroid plunged violently downward, it was not merely a visual spectacle of doom. A shock wave formed ahead of it like an immense wall of compressed air, forcing everything aside with brutal, unstoppable force. The atmosphere, the very breath of the planet, was pushed to its absolute physical limits. If anyone or anything had possessed the cognitive ability to process the sound and had been close enough to hear it, the noise would have resembled an unending thunder. It was a low, guttural roar that vibrated through the bedrock, powerful enough to shake the ground even before the physical impact actually occurred. The earth trembled in anticipation of the cosmic blow. The atmospheric friction, which usually protects our world by incinerating smaller meteors, did absolutely little to slow this object down due to its enormous size. A 10-kilometer wide rock simply carries too much mass, too much momentum, for the thin layer of gas surrounding the planet to halt its progress. Instead of being stopped, the intense heat of entry caused the outer layers of the asteroid to rapidly begin to melt and vaporize. As it screamed through the stratosphere, it left behind a brilliant, luminous trail stretching for hundreds of kilometers across the sky. It was a beautiful, deadly scar painted across the heavens, marking the exact trajectory of the world's end. Where does a falling star choose to land? The universe does not aim, and it does not grant mercy. The trajectory of the rock was a matter of pure, unfeeling mathematical chance. The impact site lay in a region that we now call the Yucatan Peninsula. At that specific moment in ancient history, it was a tranquil, shallow sea. The warm waters were teeming with marine life, swimming gracefully above a seabed that had been undisturbed for epochs. In a fraction of a heartbeat, the blinding plasmasphere met the surface of the ocean. It did not splash. It did not simply sink. In less than a single, terrifying second, the entire massive store of kinetic energy that had accumulated over millions of years of silent motion through the solar system was violently unleashed. Do we have the linguistic capacity to truly describe such a phenomenal transfer of power? All the subtle gravitational tugs from Jupiter, all the momentum gathered from the long, spiraling fall toward the sun, was deposited into the Earth's crust in an instant. The sheer magnitude of this energy transfer defies human imagination. The explosion was equivalent to more than 100 million megatons of TNT. Consider the most devastating weapons ever forged by human hands. To put this cosmic strike into perspective, the blast was billions of times more powerful than the atomic bomb humanity has ever detonated. Billions of times. An atomic blast can level a city in a blinding flash, erasing concrete and steel as if they were made of dust. But this was an explosion capable of leveling an entire geological era. The kinetic energy of movement was instantly converted into heat, light, and pressure of apocalyptic proportions. In less than a single second, the absolute dominance of the dinosaurs, a reign that had lasted for over 160 million years, was brought to a blinding, deafening halt. How is it possible that an entire biological empire, spanning every continent and dominating every ecosystem, can be outmatched and outlasted by a single, lifeless rock falling from the sky? The beautiful, vibrant world of the Late Cretaceous was completely unaware that it had just received a mortal wound. The quiet, mathematical physics of the cosmos had finally collided with the fragile biology of Earth, and the terrifying 24 hours of planetary chaos had officially begun. What occurs in that singular, agonizing millisecond when the unstoppable force of the cosmos violently meets the immovable, ancient bedrock of our world? We are accustomed to thinking of the earth beneath our feet as a permanent, unyielding foundation, a solid certainty upon which all of biological history is patiently written. But at the exact point of impact, the solid crust of the Earth did not merely crack or shatter. It was forced downward with unimaginable violence and then rebounded like the surface of water struck by a massive object. Imagine the sheer, terrifying absurdity of that visual. Millions of tons of ancient, hardened rock behaving like a fragile liquid droplet in a pond. The physical laws that govern our calm, everyday existence were instantly suspended, replaced by the extreme, chaotic physics of planetary deformation. Pressures within the epicenter surged to hundreds of gigapascals, while the temperatures soared to tens of thousands of degrees Celsius. Can the human mind truly conceptualize a heat so absolute, so profoundly intense, that it makes the surface of the sun seem mild by comparison? It was a thermal environment, hot enough to vaporize solid rock almost instantly. The very bones of the Earth, the deep, dense layers of stone that had rested undisturbed in the dark for billions of years, were instantly transformed into a superheated, expanding gas. Where did this astronomical dagger strike the heart of our planet? The location of the impact played a critical role in the unimaginable scale of devastation that rapidly followed. The shallow, sunlit sea was incredibly rich in carbonate and sulfur-bearing sediments. What if the wandering stone had plunged into the deep, open abyss of the Pacific Ocean instead? Would the dinosaurs have survived to see another dawn? We will never know. Because in an act of profound cosmic cruelty, the asteroid struck one of the most chemically volatile regions on the entire globe. Because when these sulfur-rich rocks were heated to such extreme, unearthly temperatures, they rapidly released vast quantities of toxic gas directly into the fragile atmosphere, catastrophically amplifying the global climate effects that were soon to follow. It was not just a kinetic weapon, it was a chemical bomb of planetary proportions. In the immediate aftermath of the blinding flash, a colossal crater began to violently form in the region now known as the Chicxulub crater. It was a complex, horrific structure featuring a central ring of newly forged mountains, heavily compressed rock layers, and deep, agonizing fractures radiating thousands of kilometers outward into the surrounding crust. The Earth had been permanently scarred, branded by the cold, wandering hand of the universe. As the crust was pulverized and melted, where did the remnants of the Earth go? They did not simply disappear. Within the first few frantic minutes of the collision, the vaporized rock and boiling seabed sediment formed an immense, towering column of material that was blasted high into the upper atmosphere, and even reaching far beyond into near-Earth space. It was a pillar of absolute destruction, an apocalyptic geyser connecting the bleeding ground to the burning heavens. This terrifying ejecta included oceans of molten rock, superheated water vapor, and suffocating sulfur gases, creating a dark, superheated cloud that rapidly spread throughout the stratosphere. The sky was no longer a comforting canopy of blue. It was a bruised, boiling cauldron of toxic debris. In the surrounding region, the ancient, life-giving ocean briefly vaporized into nothingness, completely exposing the naked sea floor to the burning sky before the displaced water began surging back in a state of chaotic, unimaginably violent motion. The marine reptiles that had been swimming peacefully in the warm shallows just a heartbeat before were instantly erased, their forms annihilated before their primitive nervous systems could even register the sensation of pain. Is there a strange, terrible mercy in a death so rapid that it outpaces the very speed of thought? Perhaps one of the most astonishing and deeply terrifying aspects of this entire geological reshaping was the sheer speed of the entire process. The magnificent empire of the dinosaurs was the result of over 160 million years of patient, complex biological evolution. Millions of generations of life, adapting, struggling, and thriving. And yet, from the precise moment of impact to the initial stabilization of the colossal crater took only a matter of minutes. Minutes. Let that profound temporal paradox wash over you. The slow, majestic march of evolutionary time was completely hijacked and violently dismantled by the sudden, merciless speed of astronomical time. How fragile is the concept of permanence in a universe governed by such overwhelming extremes? While the physical formation of the crater was concluded in a matter of moments, its dark consequences would endure for thousands of years, casting a long, cold shadow over the entire history of life. The evidence of this impossibly brief, violent encounter is still written in the stones beneath our feet today. When modern scientists meticulously examined the thin rock layers at the geological boundary, they found ancient minerals that had been fundamentally deformed by extreme pressure, such as shocked quartz. These microscopic fractures are the direct, undeniable evidence of the immense kinetic energy released by the collision. They are frozen screams of the Earth. These permanent traces serve as the physical, everlasting signature of a cosmic explosion carved deeply into the planet's crust. They are the silent witnesses to the exact moment the world broke. Viewed from the silent safety of space, the scene would have resembled a brilliant, blinding spark piercing straight through the white cloud layers, leaving behind a long, dark plume of glowing plasma. A tiny, almost insignificant blemish on the face of a blue marble. But from the ground, from the terrifying perspective of the breathing creatures that were trapped beneath the falling sky, it would have looked exactly like the end of the world approaching. There was a blinding, all-consuming light that erased shadows and burned retinas, followed instantly by a rapidly rising heat that baked the air in the lungs, and the very air itself trembling violently as the shock waves tore through the atmosphere. The majestic herbivores that had been grazing peacefully, the apex predators that had been stalking their prey, all raised their heavy heads to face a terror they could not comprehend. What followed this initial, devastating strike was no longer a single, isolated collision, but a terrifying, unstoppable chain reaction on a planetary scale. Millions of tons of ancient rock had vaporized into the ether. Invisible, crushing shock waves rippled outward around the globe, and a colossal impact crater had finalized its shape in the boiling bedrock. The absolute ruler of the Late Cretaceous was not a giant reptile with fearsome teeth. The new ruler was chaos. The heavens had fallen, the earth had shattered, and the most terrifying 24 hours in the history of our planet had only just begun. What happens to the invisible breath of the world when it is violently pushed beyond its physical limits? The blinding light of the impact was only the first messenger of doom, a silent herald of the kinetic wrath that was about to unfold. Close behind that searing flash, moving far faster than the speed of sound, came the true, devastating force of the wandering stone. An immense, invisible wall of highly compressed air raced outward from the burning epicenter in all directions. This was not a wind as we understand it. A wind is a fluid movement of atmospheric gases. This was a solid, unstoppable wave of absolute crushing pressure. Imagine standing thousands of kilometers away from the impact zone, nestled safely within the deep, humid embrace of a prehistoric fern forest. The sky above you suddenly loses its familiar, comforting hue, replaced rapidly by a murky, terrifying shade of red and orange, glowing ominously like a bruised, bloody sunset, even though the sun has not yet set. You look around at the ancient, towering conifers, completely unaware that a supersonic hammer is hurtling toward you through the very air you breathe. Because the shockwave travels faster than the speed of sound, there is absolutely no acoustic warning of its arrival. The forest does not whisper. The winged reptiles do not cry out in alarm. The crushing wall arrives in profound, absolute silence. When it finally strikes, it flattens the massive trees as if they were nothing more than brittle, dried twigs, snapping millions of trunks in a fraction of a second. It strips the lush, green flesh from the bones of the earth, leaving a scoured, barren wasteland in its immediate wake. How incredibly fragile is the biological form when confronted by an atmosphere that has suddenly been turned into a weapon of solid force. The air trembled, vibrating with an unnatural frequency that ruptured the delicate internal organs of the magnificent beasts that stood helplessly in its path. But the violent betrayal of the natural world did not end with the sky. What is our most fundamental, deeply ingrained assumption as living creatures, if not the absolute, unyielding stability of the ground upon which we walk? As the atmospheric shockwave tore the forest apart from above, an even darker terror began to ripple through the crust of the earth from below. The sheer kinetic energy transferred into the bedrock was so staggeringly immense that it activated dormant fault lines simultaneously across vast continental regions. The tectonic plates, the massive, slow-moving rocky foundations of the continents themselves, suddenly shuddered in violent unison. Have you ever considered the terrifying visual of solid stone behaving like the surface of a stormy, churning sea? The ground experienced rolling vibrations completely comparable to the most powerful earthquakes ever recorded by human instruments, but amplified across a horrifying global scale. Massive gaping fissures tore open in the trembling soil, indiscriminately swallowing ancient trees and terrified herds of armored herbivores into the dark, crushing depths below. The familiar landscape was violently and permanently reshaped within a matter of minutes. Entire mountainsides collapsed in colossal landslides, burying deep valleys under millions of tons of displaced earth and rock. For the dinosaurs, creatures of such immense size and supreme physical confidence, the sudden, violent loss of their footing must have been a moment of pure, unadulterated terror. The world was no longer a stable stage for their dominance. It had become an active, unpredictable meat grinder. Yet, neither the crushing air nor the shattered earth could compare to the apocalyptic fury of the oceans. Water is the ancient, gentle cradle of life, the nurturing solvent from which all biological complexity on this planet originally emerged. But how does that gentle cradle react when it is violently struck by a falling star? Along the vast, intricate coastlines of the surrounding continents, the first sign of the impending aquatic doom was an eerie, deeply unnatural withdrawal of the tide. The vibrant, shallow sea suddenly pulled back from the shores, draining away with terrifying, impossible speed. It retreated for kilometers, exposing the dark, hidden seabed like a vast, gaping, open wound. Millions of marine reptiles and ancient fish were left hopelessly stranded in the suffocating air, thrashing blindly in the sudden absence of their entire aquatic world. The abrupt silence of the retreating ocean must have been profoundly unsettling to any creature watching from the shoreline. Why does the sea run away? Where does all that incomprehensible volume of water go? It was gathering, drawing rapidly backward to accumulate the staggering energy that had been violently injected into the oceanic basin. The energy transferred into the water was mathematically equivalent to millions of major earthquakes occurring at the exact same time, driving the fluid mass with unimaginable force. When the water finally returned, it was no longer a sea. It was a moving, liquid mountain. Modern geophysical models indicate that the tsunami generated immediately after the Chicxulub impact may have exceeded 1 kilometer in height near the source of the collision. A wall of dark, churning water over 1,000 meters tall, entirely blocking out the glowing red sky, hurtling forward with the unstoppable momentum of a derailed moon. As this monstrous wave spread outward across the deep oceanic basins, it maintained terrifying heights of hundreds of meters, driving immense volumes of water at speeds of hundreds of kilometers per hour. Can you even begin to picture the sheer, terrifying majesty of such a wave? It did not break and crash like a normal wave upon a beach. It simply swallowed the beach entirely and continued its relentless march inward. When these colossal waves violently struck the land masses, they were not merely composed of salt water, they were heavily armed. The churning crests carried millions of tons of dark mud, pulverized rock, uprooted forests, deep sea sediment, and even glowing molten fragments of the Earth's crust that had rained down from the atmosphere. The ocean had become a grinding liquid bulldozer. In many regions, the surging toxic seawater rushed tens to hundreds of kilometers inland, completely ignoring the ancient, established boundaries between the ocean and the land. Entire coastal ecosystems, vibrant, bustling networks of life that had evolved in delicate harmony over millions of years, were violently swept away and erased within a matter of hours. The sheer force of the water scoured the continental bedrock clean, mixing the dead with the living in a chaotic, swirling vortex of absolute destruction. Today, millions of years later, geological evidence hidden deep beneath our feet still reveals these chaotic, overturned sediment layers stretching all the way from North America to the shores of Europe. It is the permanent, fossilized proof that the megatsunami traveled on a truly global scale, rewriting the geography of the Earth in a single, devastating stroke. What does it mean for a planet when its most fundamental elements, the air, the earth, and the water, simultaneously turn against the very life they once nurtured? The majestic dinosaurs, the undisputed masters of the land, found themselves drowning in an ocean that had seemingly decided to climb the mountains. The era of water had completely washed away the grand illusion of their dominance, leaving behind only shattered bones buried in deep, suffocating mud. But the rising water was only half of the horror. As the continents drowned in the dark, churning flood, The boiling sky above was preparing to unleash a second, completely different kind of rain, one that would guarantee there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. As the great churning waves of the displaced oceans aggressively scoured the coastlines of the ancient continents, leaving behind a ruined landscape of uprooted trees and drowned giants, the catastrophe did not simply stop at the oceans. The true horror of the Wandering Stone was multidimensional, attacking the fragile biosphere from the ground, from the water, and most terrifyingly, from the heavens above. When the colossal asteroid violently struck the shallow, sulfurous seabed, it did not merely dig a massive crater. The sheer, incomprehensible kinetic force of the impact blasted trillions of tons of pulverized rock upward into the freezing vacuum of space. Imagine the very crust of the Earth, the solid foundation upon which millions of generations of dinosaurs had confidently walked, suddenly being vomited back into the eternal night. Some of this superheated, shattered material managed to escape the gravitational grasp of the atmosphere briefly, entering short-lived orbits around the bleeding planet before the inescapable, absolute pull of gravity demanded its immediate return, falling back to Earth. Modern scientists refer to these microscopic, lethal particles as tektites and spherules. They were nothing less than countless droplets of molten, liquefied rock that rapidly solidified in midair as they plummeted backward through the upper atmosphere. But what happens when trillions of these tiny glassy beads re-enter the atmospheric envelope at the exact same moment? A single shooting star is a moment of fleeting beauty, a quiet whisper against the dark. But the skies of the Late Cretaceous did not whisper. As this unimaginably vast cloud of cosmic debris violently crashed against the friction of the air, the kinetic energy of their collective return was instantly transformed into intense, inescapable heat. The entire sky, from horizon to horizon, ignited into a solid, blinding dome of descending, searing light. The heavens literally transformed into a planetary oven. On the trembling ground beneath this descending, apocalyptic inferno, the terrifying rain of fire continued relentlessly for hours. There was absolutely nowhere to run. Surface-dwelling organisms, from the magnificent, heavily armored herbivorous giants to the absolute apex predators that had never known fear, had virtually nowhere to hide from the descending heat. The deep, intricate burrows of small mammals and the dense, protective canopies of the towering fern forests offered absolutely no sanctuary against a sky that had turned into a broiler. Even in lush, verdant regions located thousands of kilometers away from the original impact site, the landscape endured intense thermal radiation and the sudden ignition of widespread, uncontrollable fires. Imagine a vast, vibrant forest, a pristine place once filled continuously with the rhythmic sound of buzzing insects and the heavy, confident footsteps of dinosaurs, now erupting into violent flames almost simultaneously. The ancient trees did not merely catch fire from a stray spark. Their broad leaves curled, blackened, and spontaneously combusted under the sheer, unyielding intensity of the radiant heat pressing down from the glowing atmosphere above. Complex climate models suggest a deeply horrifying reality regarding this moment. The total thermal energy released during this specific, agonizing phase may have been sufficient to completely burn a substantial portion of the entire planet's biomass. The green sanctuary of the Late Cretaceous, the masterpiece of millions of years of patient biological evolution, was being actively and mercilessly erased, converted into a global, smoldering funeral pyre. What does it physically feel like to attempt to breathe the air of a dying world? As the intense thermal radiation baked the continents to ash, the very atmosphere became a chaotic, turbulent system where ambient heat and crushing pressure fluctuated relentlessly. In many regions, particularly those located near the catastrophic epicenter of the blast, complex thermal models suggest that ambient temperatures may have exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius for short, agonizing periods. The air itself became an invisible, suffocating weapon. It grew bone dry and utterly scorching, growing thick with falling gray ash and superheated toxic gases, rapidly creating an environment in which taking a single breath was nearly impossible. The delicate respiratory systems of the great reptiles evolved to draw in the rich, humid oxygen of the prehistoric jungles, were completely overwhelmed, searing their lungs with every panicked, desperate intake of air. How could any complex biological organism possibly process such profound physiological shock, drastically reducing their chances of survival to absolute zero? The immense suffocating heat did not solely originate from the burning surface alone. The immense supersonic shock waves generated by the initial impact continued to ripple violently through the atmosphere like invisible, destructive rings, constantly compressing the air and driving the temperatures even higher. Imagine standing on a completely unstable ground that trembles faintly beneath your feet, desperately breathing air as blisteringly hot as the blast from an industrial furnace, all while the dark sky above you vibrates violently under relentless waves of invisible, crushing pressure. The world was completely dismantled, stripped of every single comforting element that life requires to endure. As the global forests were reduced to glowing embers, the sky rapidly began to lose its blinding, terrifying light, trading the fire for the choking, permanent darkness of destruction. Thick, toxic smoke from the massive continental fires aggressively mixed with pulverized rock dust and vaporized oceanic water in the upper atmosphere, effectively and permanently darkening the sky. The sun, the ancient, golden, and faithful provider of energy for millions of years, was suddenly veiled behind an impenetrable curtain of planetary debris. Sunlight could only filter weakly through a dense, suffocating veil, creating the haunting, deeply unsettling appearance of a prolonged, eerie twilight that lasted for agonizing days. The vibrant colors of the Cretaceous world were drained away, replaced by the monochromatic grays and violent oranges of a dying ecosystem. And the devastation was truly absolute, reaching into environments that had seemingly escaped the initial blast. The vast ancient oceans were not spared from this violent thermal upheaval. Seawater located near the impact zone was superheated almost instantly, generating incredibly powerful, chaotic convection currents and drastically altering surface temperatures across vast oceanic areas. Remarkably, the kinetic energy of the megatsunami did not only devastate the shallow surface waters, but also violently disrupted deep marine ecosystems. For the fragile, complex marine life existing in the dark depths, it was a profound environmental shock that occurred almost instantly, tearing apart ancient food webs before the predators even realized their prey was gone. It was a beautifully orchestrated, multi-dimensional assault on the biosphere. The immense heat, the suffocating dust, and the toxic atmospheric gases would soon push Earth into an unprecedented, extreme condition, where temperatures spiked uncontrollably, the land trembled endlessly, and life faced its most brutal, uncompromising survival test yet. The fiery rain of the sky was merely the final, blinding flash of the cosmic executioner's blade. As the embers slowly began to cool and the ashes drifted silently down upon the shattered bones of the giants, the planet prepared to enter an even darker chapter. The fire had scoured the earth, but the true prolonged agony of extinction was waiting patiently in the shadows of the impending cold. How long can a wounded world hold its breath before the darkness becomes permanent? We instinctively associate the end of the world with the chaotic violence of fire, the blinding flash of an explosion, and the deafening roar of a shattered crust. But the true, absolute eradication of an empire does not happen in the light. It happens in the slow, suffocating embrace of the cold dark. As the global firestorms that had ravaged the ancient continents finally began to burn themselves out, leaving behind a scarred, smoking wasteland of charred timber and boiling oceans, the survivors might have looked upward, hoping to see the familiar, comforting light of the sun breaking through the smoke. But dawn never came. The wandering stone from deep space, an object forged in the freezing vacuum of the cosmos, had brought the eternal night down to the surface of the earth. When the colossal asteroid violently pulverized the Yucatan seabed, it struck a region incredibly rich in sulfur-bearing sediments. This was not merely a physical collision. It was the cruelest chemical probability of the universe. The unimaginable kinetic energy of the blast instantly vaporized trillions of tons of ancient stone, mixing it with vast, unfathomable quantities of sulfur dioxide gas, and forcefully injected this toxic concoction straight into the upper stratosphere. Unlike the heavier, molten debris that had quickly rained back down to ignite the global fires, these microscopic particles of fine rock dust and sulfur aerosols were incredibly light, remaining suspended high above the chaotic weather systems of the lower atmosphere. They did not fall, but instead spread rapidly, driven by the turbulent, swirling atmospheric currents of a traumatized planet, until they wrapped completely around the globe like a dense, impenetrable burial shroud. The sun, the ancient, reliable architect of all prehistoric biology, simply ceased to exist from the perspective of the surface. Imagine the profound, creeping terror of a twilight that stretches endlessly into days, then bleeds seamlessly into weeks, and finally collapses into a seemingly eternal, formless night. The biological rhythms of every living creature on Earth had been meticulously calibrated over millions of years of evolution to the predictable, comforting cycle of daylight. Now, those internal clocks were shattered, leaving organisms completely disoriented and paralyzed by a sudden, permanent sensory deprivation. As the dense veil of sulfate aerosols actively reflected the sun's life, giving radiation back into the cold void of space, the ambient heat of the planet rapidly bled away. The tropical, humid greenhouse sanctuary that had defined the Late Cretaceous period was violently and abruptly shattered. This terrifying phenomenon is known as an impact winter, but it was not a typical seasonal winter lasting a few manageable months. It was a period of severe global cooling that may have endured for agonizing years. Average global temperatures plummeted by an astonishing 10 to 20 degrees Celsius almost simultaneously. Across the deep, vast continental interiors, entirely cut off from the slight, moderating thermal mass of the oceans, the sudden plunge in temperature may have been even more severe and unforgiving. A lush landscape once dominated by broad-leafed ferns and towering tropical conifers was suddenly, brutally encased in a creeping, deadly rime of frost and ice. The magnificent, heavy-bodied beasts that had somehow miraculously survived the supersonic atmospheric shockwaves, outrun the towering coastal megatsunamis, and hidden from the descending global firestorms, now found themselves shivering helplessly in a freezing, monochromatic wasteland. Is there a more profound, agonizing tragedy than to survive the fiery end of the world, only to realize that your ultimate reward is a slow, freezing starvation in the absolute dark? Yet, the wandering stone from the asteroid belt was not the only executioner slowly tightening the noose around the neck of the biosphere. The Earth itself was already suffering from a deep internal sickness, a terrifying geological instability that had been poisoning the skies long before the heavens fell. To fully understand the absolute hopelessness of the late Cretaceous environment, we must look away from the scarred, bruised sky and peer deep into the bleeding, ruptured mantle of the planet itself. Half a world away from the catastrophic Yucatan impact site, in the massive region we now know as India, the Earth had been violently tearing itself apart from the inside out. This sprawling geological nightmare is known to modern science as the Deccan Traps, and it was not merely a single volcanic mountain erupting, but rather one of the largest, most violent basalt provinces in the entire history of our planet. Imagine a fractured, apocalyptic landscape where the very crust of the Earth has split wide open, bleeding oceans of glowing, liquid rock across an area entirely comparable to multiple modern nations combined. The total staggering volume of this basaltic lava is estimated to have far exceeded 1 million cubic kilometers. But the true, existential danger of the Deccan Traps was not the creeping lava itself. It was the invisible, highly toxic breath of the deep Earth. These massive, relentless eruptions did not occur in a single, devastating day, or even a single year. They continued to erupt constantly for hundreds of thousands of years, releasing truly enormous, incomprehensible quantities of ancient gas directly into the atmosphere. Among the most biologically significant and dangerous of these emissions were carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. How does a complex biosphere possibly survive when the fundamental rules of the climate are constantly and violently being rewritten by the Earth itself? Carbon dioxide is a highly efficient greenhouse gas, uniquely capable of trapping solar heat within the atmosphere. Extensive geochemical studies suggest that by the late Cretaceous period, largely due to this relentless volcanic activity, atmospheric carbon dioxide levels may have already been several times higher than our pre-industrial levels today, forcing the entire globe into a warmer climate, heating the deep oceans, and aggressively shifting sea levels. The global ecosystems were already being forced to adapt continuously to a stressful, changing environment. But the brutal story of the planet's atmospheric betrayal does not end there. The massive volcanoes also spewed millions of tons of sulfur dioxide, which, when injected high into the atmosphere, forms thick sulfate aerosols that reflect sunlight away, producing severe, temporary cooling effects. This terrifying contradiction means the prehistoric climate was not only steadily warming, but it was also violently oscillating, swinging wildly back and forth between sweltering, stressful hotter phases and bitter, freezing cooler phases over incredibly extended periods. The undeniable evidence of these extreme, chaotic fluctuations is permanently preserved in deep ocean sediment cores and ancient volcanic rock layers, where modern scientists meticulously measure dramatic shifts in carbon isotopes and chemical elements over time. These data reveal a profound, horrifying truth. The climate of the Earth underwent multiple, highly significant and stressful changes even before the cosmic extinction event ever occurred. The global biosphere was already deeply exhausted, pushed to its absolute biological and physiological limits by the relentless, grinding geological instability of the Deccan Traps. The magnificent ecosystems were incredibly fragile. Their complex interwoven food webs stretched dangerously taut over an evolutionary abyss. And then, at the absolute worst possible moment in the entire history of biological life, the asteroid violently struck the Earth. The massive instantaneous injection of impact-generated dust and sulfur perfectly and tragically combined with the ongoing, relentless volcanic atmospheric pollution, creating an inescapable compound catastrophe of planetary proportions. The world was violently plunged into a deep, freezing darkness that stripped away the last remaining illusions of safety. As the remaining ambient warmth of the planet rapidly bled away into the eternal, uncaring night, the true silent killer of the giant reptiles was finally and irrevocably unleashed. Without the golden light of the sun, the very foundation of life itself, the silent engine that powered every beating heart on the planet was about to break completely. How does a biological empire truly end? Does it conclude with a deafening roar? Or does it simply fade away into an agonizing, lingering silence? We have witnessed the blinding flash of the cosmic strike, the tearing of the continental crust, and the violent, boiling fury of the displaced oceans. But the absolute eradication of the dinosaurs, the final, irreversible unmaking of their 160 million year reign, was not accomplished by the heat of the fire. It was perfectly, ruthlessly executed by the suffocating grip of an empty stomach. When the thick, impenetrable shroud of pulverized rock, soot, and sulfuric aerosol completely enveloped the stratosphere, the fundamental engine of the prehistoric world was violently shut down. Consider the profoundly quiet miracle of photosynthesis. For hundreds of millions of years, the magnificent flora of this planet has performed a silent, daily alchemy, reaching up to the heavens to capture the golden radiation of the sun and translating that raw, stellar energy into the biological sugars that sustain absolutely every beating heart on Earth. What happens to the delicate, vibrant web of life when that stellar tether is suddenly and permanently severed? As the prolonged, suffocating twilight stretched endlessly into a freezing, starless night, the vast emerald forests of the Late Cretaceous began to starve. The ancient cycads, the towering conifers, and the broad-leafed ferns did not die instantly. Instead, they experienced a slow, cellular asphyxiation. Without the life-giving light to fuel their internal chemistry, Their green fronds rapidly withered, turning brittle and brown before cascading silently to the ash-covered earth. The vibrant, breathing lungs of the planet were collapsing, exhaling their final breath in the suffocating dark. Have you ever truly pondered the terrifying fragility of a food chain? It is not a robust, unbreakable ladder, but rather a precarious, trembling house of cards where the absolute massive weight of the apex is entirely dependent upon the microscopic, silent labor of the base. As the deep, freezing darkness settled over the wounded continents, the true, agonizing cost of being a giant was mercilessly revealed. For millions of years, immense physical size had been the ultimate evolutionary advantage, an impenetrable biological armor against predators and the elements. But in a world completely devoid of sunlight, that magnificent size became a suffocating, inescapable prison. The great herbivores, creatures possessing bodies so massive they rivaled the size of modern houses, were driven by biological furnaces that required truly staggering quantities of fresh vegetation every single day just to keep their heavy blood pumping. Imagine the profound, deepening panic gripping a herd of massive armored titans as they wander blindly through a freezing, monochromatic wasteland. They instinctively lower their heavy heads to the ground, searching desperately for the familiar, succulent ferns, only to find nothing but cold, toxic ash and the rotting, frozen husks of dead trees. Their powerful jaws, evolved to effortlessly crush thick branches and tough foliage, are completely useless against the invisible, creeping enemy of starvation. They are forced to strip the bitter, lifeless bark from dead trunks, chewing on indigestible wood in a desperate, futile attempt to quiet the agonizing, hollow rumbling within their massive torsos. But there is no nourishment left in the dead earth. How long does it take for a creature weighing 10,000 kilograms to starve to death? It is not a quick, merciful end. It is a slow, methodical draining of vitality. Their immense muscles, once capable of shaking the very ground with every footstep, begin to wither and cannibalize themselves for fuel. Their heavy, lumbering strides become sluggish and uncoordinated, their immense forms shivering violently against the unnatural, creeping frost of the impact winter. One by one, unable to carry the massive burden of their own starving bodies, they simply collapse into the dark, freezing mud. The heavy armor plates, the terrifying spiked tails, and the massive protective horns that had guaranteed their survival for countless generations offered absolutely no defense against the cold, unyielding mathematics of thermodynamics. They died quietly, their massive lungs laboring for a final, frosty breath, completely abandoned by the sun that had birthed them. But what of the absolute rulers of the shadows? The apex predators that had stood completely unchallenged at the very pinnacle of the ancient food web. As the majestic herbivores began to collapse and die across the frozen landscapes, the terrifying carnivores initially found themselves surrounded by an unprecedented, macabre bounty. The freezing ambient temperatures acted as a planetary preservative, turning the dying continents into a vast, chilling slaughterhouse of frozen meat. For a fleeting, deceptive moment, the giant predators may have gorged themselves upon the fallen, feasting in the eerie, perpetual twilight without the need to expend precious energy on the hunt. But how incredibly cruel is the illusion of abundance in a world that has already stopped producing life? The banquet of the dead is strictly finite. As the months dragged agonizingly on, the frozen carcasses were stripped down to the bone or buried deeply beneath relentless drifts of toxic sulfuric snow. The terrifying kings of the Cretaceous, the ultimate perfect killing machines meticulously sculpted by millions of years of predatory evolution, suddenly found themselves wandering through a profoundly empty, silent world. A perfect predator requires perfect prey. What does a biological weapon do when there is absolutely no war left to fight? Their razor-sharp teeth, capable of crushing bone and tearing through thick muscle, could not extract nutrients from the frozen earth. Their binocular vision, evolved to spot the slightest twitch of a hiding prey, stared uselessly into a dark, impenetrable fog. Driven completely mad by the gnawing, hollow agony in their empty bellies, these magnificent beasts likely turned upon one another in a final, desperate frenzy of cannibalism. The remaining survivors tearing at the flesh of their own kind, just to survive one more miserable, freezing week. But eventually, even the victors of those pathetic, starving battles were forced to succumb. The slow, creeping exhaustion overtook their powerful limbs. The mighty thundering roar that had once sent ripples of absolute terror through the ancient forests was reduced to a weak, ragged gasp, immediately swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the dead planet. The ultimate executioners were slowly and mercilessly executed by the very ecosystem they had once perfectly dominated. Is there any true sanctuary to be found in the deep water when the entire sky turns to stone? The tragedy of the impact winter was not confined to the land. It brutally and systematically dismantled the ancient oceans with the exact same uncompromising efficiency. Beneath the churning, freezing waves, the marine food web was anchored entirely by microscopic floating flora known as phytoplankton. Just like the towering ferns on the continents, these tiny, fragile organisms were absolutely dependent upon the golden radiation of the sun to survive. As the thick, atmospheric dust completely blocked out the light, the surface waters rapidly cooled, and the phytoplankton simply ceased to multiply. They died by the countless trillions, their microscopic, lifeless bodies drifting downward into the black abyss like a silent, devastating underwater snowfall. As the foundation of the marine ecosystem violently shattered, the dominoes fell with terrifying speed. The small, filtering organisms starved, followed rapidly by the vast schools of ancient fish. Finally, the colossal marine reptiles, the sleek, terrifying mosasaurs, and the long-necked plesiosaurs that had ruled the oceanic depths, found themselves swimming frantically through a dark, increasingly barren void. Their massive hydrodynamic bodies required immense caloric intake, but the fertile, bustling reefs had transformed into silent, aquatic graveyards. They roamed the freezing, empty currents, their sleek bodies slowly wasting away, until they, too, drifted lifelessly down to join the thick layer of death accumulating on the ancient sea floor. Once the first, fragile link of the biological chain had been violently broken by the fading of the light, entire, magnificent ecosystems gracefully and inevitably fell completely out of balance. biological networks that had taken nature millions of years to meticulously weave were brutally unraveled and dismantled in a matter of months. The Earth had been entirely sterilized of its giants. The booming, vibrant symphony of the Late Cretaceous was finally over, replaced by a cold, haunting silence that stretched from pole to pole. The era of the dinosaurs did not end in a glorious, fiery battle. It ended in a slow, pathetic whimper in the dark, a freezing capitulation to the unforgiving laws of an indifferent universe. And yet, beneath the deep layers of toxic ash, buried safely within the shivering earth, tiny, frightened eyes peered out into the endless night. If the giants were destined to inherit the ashes, who was destined to inherit the dawn? When the gods of the ancient world finally fell, their massive bones sinking silently into the freezing, toxic mud, who was left to inherit the ruins of the earth? We are often taught to believe that evolution is a steady, predictable march toward physical perfection, a grand arena where only the strongest, the fastest, and the most heavily armored are guaranteed the right to survive. But what happens when the fundamental rules of the arena are violently and permanently rewritten in a single day? As the impact winter stretched its suffocating, icy fingers across the scorched continents, the traditional hierarchy of the Late Cretaceous was entirely inverted. The magnificent, specialized traits that had once defined the absolute pinnacle of biological success, immense size, specialized diets, and extreme physical power, were suddenly transformed into lethal liabilities. The survival of life on this shattered planet no longer belonged to the giants. It belonged exclusively to the small, the frightened, and the incredibly flexible. Beneath the charred, smoking remnants of the once vibrant fern forests, hiding in deep, intricate networks of subterranean tunnels, were tiny, unassuming creatures. They were early mammals, our most ancient and direct ancestors. They were not majestic or terrifying. They were no larger than a modern mouse or a small weasel, weighing only a few dozen grams. For tens of millions of years, they had lived a marginalized existence in the perpetual shadow of the giant reptiles, scurrying through the damp undergrowth at night, existing solely on the scraps left behind by the absolute masters of the daylight. But in the terrifying aftermath of the cosmic strike, their profound insignificance became their ultimate salvation. When the sky turned into a falling ocean of fire, the deep earth, the very same earth that had violently betrayed the dinosaurs with rolling earthquakes, acted as a natural, insulating bunker for these tiny mammals. They simply retreated into the dark, wrapping their small, fur-covered bodies together in the quiet depths of their burrows, entirely insulated from the blinding thermal radiation and the subsequent creeping frost of the long night. But safety from the elements is only half of the equation. How does a creature survive in a world where the vast majority of the food web has been systematically eradicated? The true genius of the mammalian survival strategy lay in their absolute lack of dietary specialization. Unlike the massive lumbering herbivores that required hundreds of pounds of fresh green foliage every single day, or the apex predators that demanded massive quantities of fresh meat, these tiny survivors were opportunistic omnivores. They were nature's ultimate pragmatists. In a freezing, desolate landscape, completely devoid of living plants, they simply ate whatever the dying world had to offer. They scavenged the rotting, frozen carcasses of the fallen giants. They cracked open the exoskeletons of dead insects. They consumed the decaying, subterranean fungi that began to bloom in the dark, nutrient-rich ash. Their incredibly low absolute energy requirements, combined with a digestive system willing to process virtually any organic material, allowed them to quietly endure a period of prolonged, apocalyptic scarcity that effortlessly starved the magnificent rulers of the previous age. Yet, the mammals were not the only fragile sparks of life to navigate this pitch-black corridor of extinction. Alongside them, another highly adaptable group managed to cling to the frayed edges of existence. We look at the fossil record and mourn the total loss of the dinosaurs. But is that absolute narrative truly accurate? The terrifying, majestic beasts of the Late Cretaceous did not completely vanish from the Earth. They merely shed their heavy, lumbering forms and took to the sky. The direct feathered descendants of the theropod dinosaurs, the birds, somehow managed to cross the devastating boundary of the asteroid impact. But just as with the mammals, it was not the massive, specialized avian predators that survived the darkness. The fossil record reveals a deeply specific, haunting truth. The avian lineages that successfully endured the apocalypse were primarily the small, ground-dwelling birds that possessed beaks specifically adapted for eating seeds. Why would a diet of seeds be the defining difference between absolute extinction and continuing a genetic legacy? Because a seed is not just a piece of food, it is a biological time capsule. When the global firestorms incinerated the towering forests, and the subsequent impact, winter froze the soil. The adult plants died by the billions. But buried safely within the charred, frozen dirt lay trillions of dormant seeds. These tiny, hardened packets of biological potential were incredibly resistant to both intense heat and prolonged cold. They could patiently persist in the ruined soil for years, waiting for a spring that seemed as though it might never arrive. For the small, ground-dwelling birds, these buried seeds became an invisible, vital lifeline. While the massive carnivores starved to death, surrounded by frozen meat they could no longer hunt, the tiny birds simply scratched at the toxic ash, uncovering the hidden, stable energy reserves left behind by the ghost forests. Is there not a profound, poetic irony in the fact that the continuation of the majestic dinosaur lineage was ultimately guaranteed by the smallest, most unassuming creatures patiently pecking at the dirt in the dark? And supporting this fragile, desperate ecosystem of survivors were the ultimate unsung heroes of the biological world, the insects. The world had become a boundless, freezing graveyard, a terrifying landscape of rotting wood and decaying flesh. For the vast majority of life, this was an apocalyptic wasteland. But for the decomposers, the beetles, the roaches, and the burrowing worms, it was an infinite, unprecedented feast. The fossil record clearly shows that the extinction rate of insects was drastically lower than that of vertebrates. As the grand, complex ecosystems collapsed, these tiny recyclers worked tirelessly in the shadows, slowly breaking down the monumental volume of death and quietly returning crucial, locked nutrients back into the sterile soil. They were the essential biological bridge between the violent end of the old world and the slow, painful genesis of the new one, preventing the fragile, broken cycles of life from completely and permanently unraveling. From the deepest, darkest ashes of unimaginable catastrophe, a new, drastically different era began to quietly take shape. As the agonizing decades turned into centuries, and the centuries bled slowly into millennia, the thick, toxic atmosphere gradually began to clear. The heavy blanket of sulfur and pulverized rock slowly settled back to the earth, and the golden, life-giving radiation of the sun finally pierced the lingering gloom, touching the surface of a deeply wounded but surviving planet. The world that emerged from the long darkness was no longer a world ruled by magnificent, towering giants. The grand stage of the Earth was shockingly, beautifully empty. In the first hundreds of thousands of years following the Great Dying, the planet resembled a vast, silent biological laboratory. The ancient, complex ecosystems that had taken millions of years to build had been violently wiped clean, leaving behind a blank, fertile canvas. The forests slowly began to regrow, beginning with hardy, pioneering species such as fast-growing ferns and small, resilient flowering plants. As the green slowly crept back across the scarred continents, it laid a completely new, untainted foundation for the rebuilding of the food chains. Life had stubbornly returned, but it returned in a structure that was fundamentally, entirely different from the age that had preceded it. With the terrifying giant reptiles permanently removed from the ecological equation, the small, hiding mammals finally crept out of their subterranean burrows into the returning light. For the first time in their long, marginalized evolutionary history, there were no massive predators waiting to crush them, and no giant herbivores hoarding the resources of the forests. The ecological niches, the myriad roles within the environment that dictate how life evolves and specializes, were left entirely vacant. What followed was one of the most explosive, rapid periods of adaptive evolution in the entire history of the Earth. Within roughly 10 million years after the skies finally cleared, a mere blink of an eye in geological time, the size, complexity, and sheer diversity of mammals increased dramatically. They radiated outward across the recovering continents, evolving rapidly from tiny, shivering scavengers into magnificent new forms. Some grew large, developing hooves to run across the expanding grasslands as the new herbivores. Others sharpened their teeth and claws, ascending to the top of the food chain as the new apex predators. Some took to the returning trees, developing grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, while others abandoned the land entirely, returning to the oceans to eventually become the massive, intelligent leviathans of the deep. Over tens of millions of years, the continents continued their slow, grinding drift across the globe. Massive mountain ranges were violently pushed upward into the sky, and sweeping ice ages came and went, continually testing and refining the resilience of this new mammalian empire. Within that shifting, dynamic, and ever-changing world, a specific lineage of arboreal primates was slowly forced out of the receding canopies and onto the open, dangerous savannas. They learned to stand upright, freeing their hands to fashion tools from the very stones that surrounded them. They learned to harness the terrible power of fire, the very same element that had once scoured the continents of life. And eventually, around 300,000 years ago, a remarkably brief moment in the grand, sweeping narrative of the cosmos. A new, uniquely conscious species appeared in the heart of Africa. We are the ultimate, undeniable outcome of that ancient, terrifying catastrophe. Our sprawling, illuminated cities, our complex, beautiful languages, our deep, searching explorations of the very cosmos that once tried to destroy us. Every single aspect of human existence is directly tethered to the long, quiet journey of that wandering stone. Have you ever truly paused to consider the staggering, terrifying fragility of our own genesis? If that celestial fragment, born in the dark from an ancient, meaningless collision between dead rocks, had been nudged onto a slightly different trajectory by the gravity of Jupiter, if it had arrived at Earth's orbit just a few hours earlier or a few hours later, if it had plunged deeply into the boundless waters of the Pacific Ocean instead of striking the volatile, sulfur-rich shallows of the Yucatan Peninsula, the dinosaurs would likely have survived the impact. The magnificent reptilian empire might have continued its unbroken reign right up into the present day. The tiny, frightened mammals would never have been granted the empty stage required to evolve, to grow, to think, and to eventually look up at the stars and wonder where they came from. We exist strictly because a cosmic accident violently cleared the board. The Chicxulub impact event 66 million years ago was not merely a distant catastrophe. It was the brutal, necessary forge that made our reality possible. It is a sobering, terrifying reminder that the history of life is not a guaranteed, upward trajectory of progress, but a fragile narrative written by events that are entirely random, yet absolutely decisive. The story of the dinosaurs' final, terrifying day is not just a memory of a distant, lost past. It is a profound, echoing warning about the unforgiving, mathematical laws of the universe. The cosmos does not know we are here, and it does not care. As we look up into the vast, beautiful expanse of the night sky, we must realize that we are standing on the very same fragile, spinning rock as the giants who came before us. We are the lucky inheritors of the darkness, the children of the ashes. But if a similar, silent shadow were to emerge from the deep void tomorrow, falling toward our delicate blue world with the exact same uncaring velocity, would we be the first species in the history of the Earth capable of looking up, truly understanding the mathematical laws of our impending doom, and finding a way to rewrite the final chapter? Or are we, despite all our perceived intelligence and technological majesty, just waiting for our own blinding flash of light to violently clear the stage for whoever or whatever is destined to follow us in the dark?